Alright, hey there everybody, it's AW. And, here to continue Fascism as a Mass Movement. This is the third time we've read it, and we're only about 40% of the way through. Some good history on, good history of fascism, as well as a little bit of theoretical analysis. Not much theoretical analysis so far, although it's kind of intermingled necessarily with the history. But I think we're getting off where we left off, which is page 20, midway. I thought that was a good place to stop, since it seems that the topic was going to change in the next few paragraphs. So let's keep going. In the huge nervous tension that the Italians lived through in the years 1919 to 21, not only did they experience economic hardships, but they came to feel that their former allies had done them down in the peace treaties. Ignoring the advantages and possessions that the peace had brought Italy, attention tended to focus on the little that Italy had not succeeded in getting. Thus, Fiume, an Adriatic seaport inhabited by Italian nationals, had not been allotted to Italy as part of the peace treaties. Many Italians got excited over the fate of Fiume. D'Annunzio assembled a volunteer corps, transgressed national boundaries against the will of the government, and occupied Fiume. The poet had acted in the manner of Garibaldi. While the government dithered, D'Annunzio had gathered the patriotic youth and marched at their head. Yes, this reminds me of what we were reading last time, the youth movements, and how they were more important than I had expected, in that it seems to be a thing that repeats with fascist tendencies. Like today, stuff on the so-called alt-right and whatnot, it's kind of a youth movement. It's not really, you don't see many old people out there. It's mostly, people in 20s, 30s. Strapping young bucks.
People, like in the January 6th, were very old people. They were like, a lot of them are veterans.
Yeah, but those weren't like those aren't exactly the fascists that people are scared of. A lot of those people are just plain moronic.
Charlottesville, right?
But anyways, I'll also just like to recall the last time, you weren't here for the last reading, Josh, but yeah, beyond that, there was the student movements. There was also just the fact that there was a significant portion of that historical moment in which the left had all the chances and literally was in official power and did not use it at all, completely squandered it. I think a lot of it seemed that some of, if I recall, it's been a couple of weeks, quite a bit of it was towing the regular political line too much when it made no sense to do so, not doing things that were very clearly popular, and that, wouldn't have been a bad thing to do had they done it. So then, this fascist swooped in and, started to promise to do, and to some extent actually do, what the left had failed to. Mussolini realized that the extraordinary significance of this expedition to Fiume. Mussolini realized the extraordinary significance of this expedition to Fiume. He mobilized his party for the action, did everything he could to sustain the propaganda for D'Annunzio. This was the first time national stormtroopers were again deployed against the socialist and pacifist wave that swept through Italy in those years. Gradually, Mussolini's own stormtroopers attracted the largest following, and by 1921, fascism had again become a major political force in Italy. The party expanded thanks less to standard methods used by political movements into the violent offensive opened by the stormtroopers, this time not against an external enemy as under Garibaldi and D'Annunzio, but against the enemy at home, the organized socialists and communists. Yeah, that does remind me of, like, Mussolini and some other guys were already popular at the time, and they led a nationalist, like, military campaign. I forget where, and they lost so badly that the resources it cost the nation was too big for people to ignore, and so everybody was really pissed off at the fascist party in Italy for a few years. And I think that's when the left came back into power and then did absolutely nothing, just squandered it. The liberal government felt the ground shaking under its feet. The workers and the poor peasants rejected the ruling system, yet even among the capitalists of the north and the powerful southern landowners, there was a growing disillusionment with the regime for doing nothing about the red flag. The so-called liberal governments of the pre-war epoch had kept themselves alive through electoral manipulation in the central and southern parts of Italy, where the local administrations had colluded with the landowners and political cliques of the area in mobilizing votes for the right. These breezy days of the old-style liberalism were now over. Since the World War, it had simply melted in the heat of the class struggle. The liberals returned to power in 1919 only because the mass of the population hated the imperialists, while the socialists, on the other hand, were not powerful enough as yet to take over the government. The liberal prime ministers of 1919-22 were mere stopgaps in whom no one put any confidence at all. For this reason, they made no daring decisions during their term of office and wished to preserve good relations with all parties and classes. Mussolini again appealed to the younger intellectuals and, in particular, to the veterans to rally around himself. The liberal prime ministers and the socialists had ruined the victory. They had pushed the country into disaster. They had insulted and neglected the soldiers, veterans, and the war disabled. Now, fascism would draw the necessary conclusions from the victory and build a new, proud, and prosperous Italy. The unemployed students, traders, and workers whom the socialists had not been able to help came to Mussolini. When his stormtroopers won their first skirmishes, demolished Union offices, beat up militants, sometimes assassinated them, the capitalists realized that a new war was rising for them. The industrialists now began to finance fascism, and even the landowners willingly joined the new movement to suppress the small tenants under their control. The fascist punitive expeditions moved outwards into the villages where, by violence and murder, they completely smashed the local organizations of agricultural workers and small peasants. The landowner could again sleep safely at last. In the course of 1921, Mussolini became the much-admired protagonist of the bourgeoisie and big landowners. The younger intellectuals and the veterans rushed to him en masse. Everywhere the Italian workers put up the most courageous resistance to the fascists and their terror squads. Of course, there was no nationally coordinated campaign in defense against the White Terror, one that mobilized the full strength of workers throughout the country. But in all places, the workers fought the terror squads with heroism, even if from isolated and losing positions. If one looks closely at the history of the Italian working class in the year 1921-22, at the endlessly long series of essentially similar events, arson, assaults, demolitions, murders, one comes to the conclusion that despite all the unfavorable circumstances, the working class would have destroyed fascism if the state power had shown even the slightest element of neutrality or objectivity. But wherever the proletariat successfully resisted fascism, the state gendarmerie? Don't quite know that word. Look that up, Josh. Because I can't. No, this doesn't have it in there. The state gendarmerie.
Force of the gendarmes. Very helpful.
Alright, who are the gendars?
It's like a police force.
Yes, they're Stasi?
Yeah, it's an armed police officer in France and French-speaking countries.
Didn't know Italy was a French-speaking country.
Oh, it's the word usually used for,
Okay. The state gendarmerie, or the army, immediately intervened. The workers may well have been a match for the fascist stormtroopers, but they were no match for the organized armed power of the state. The police simply shot the actively fighting workers or jailed them, and the fascists would then re-emerge to complete their work of destruction in triumph. The Italian experience repeated a pattern discernible in the Russian pogroms. The terrorist squads succeeded because they could always count on the state. The liberal politicians of 1919-20 had not dared to provoke the workers in those years. When the socialist wave ran high, they had to reckon with the coming proletarian revolution. The liberal government had proclaimed a sort of political neutrality vis-à-vis the different classes in struggle. Even during the occupation of the factories in the autumn of 1920, the government had withheld permission to fire on the workers and contented itself with diplomatic interventions. But once Mussolini began his reemergence, the bourgeoisie recovered its nerve, and the new mood now infected the bureaucracy, the police chiefs, and the army officers. When the fascists showed such bravado in attacking the red troublemakers, the police could hardly hold themselves back. The remarkable contradictions in Italian society in 1919 and 20 had undermined the legal administration of the state so profoundly that no respect was left for it any longer. In a purely technical sense, the regular army and the police were still vastly stronger than the fascist gangs. But the fascists had the upcoming uncompromising will to smash the workers' organizations. It was always the fascists who launched the attacks, and only then would the state move into action with its massive machinery of repression tailing after them. If the situation became critical, the state would take on the main job, and the fascists would take the credit for the victory. Imagine a fight where there are 5 people on one side, armed only with sticks, and a group of 10 persons on the other, each carrying a revolver. At first, these 10 persons do not dare to use their revolvers. The 5 people with sticks can laugh at them with impunity. Suddenly, a young fellow turns up and rushes on the 5 of them with a loud cry. Only now does the group of 10 draw its revolvers and shoot down its 5 defenseless opponents. In this analogy, the young chap who runs out shouting is fascism, and the 10 armed individuals are the bourgeoisie and their legal state power. The 5 people with sticks represent the organized working class. In short, the emergence of fascism never alters the real balance of class forces between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. If the proletariat were really stronger than the bourgeoisie, it would win, with or without fascism. However, if the capitalist class is objectively the stronger force, then the emergence of fascism can bring about the collapse of the workers' movement. In central and southern Italy, Mussolini protected the landowners from an agrarian revolution, and they became his closest friends after 1921. The mass of the small peasantry fell back into submission, as before, once the peasant leagues had been demolished. They kept quiet and obeyed, but they were not active fascists. To the petty bourgeoisie of central and southern Italy, moreover, fascism remained something quite external. In northern Italy, on the other hand, in the modern advanced parts of the country, fascism became, after 1921, a real mass movement. It is true that the large mass of organized industrial workers remained true to their earlier convictions, but here in the north, apart from the capitalists who financed him, apart from the students, unemployed veterans, and adventurers who flocked to his storm troops, Mussolini gradually won the active support of the urban middle class. In the parliamentary elections of May 1921, he won an astonishing proportion of votes, chiefly in Milan, Pavia, Bologna, and Ferrara. He entered Parliament at the head of 33 deputies. It has often been argued that the modern middle classes have a profound fanatical hatred of the working class, that given the slightest chance they would take arms and slaughter the proletariat. The middle class lives in fear of its own proletarianization, and out of the sense of anguish created by this prospect, it loathes the workers and attempts to trample them underfoot. This is a strange theory. Is it conceivable that small artisans and traders should harbor such murderous hatred against workers who are often their best customers and, in the working class districts at least, the only people for whom they make any sort of living? Is it likely that the white-collar employees should harbor secret desires of betraying their blue-collar colleagues in the company? Is it likely that a student at school and university would actually be awaiting for the chance to shoot their thoroughly oppressed comrades from the masses? One has only to recall the quite banal truth that in today's conditions there are innumerable and imperceptible gradations between the lower middle class and the proletariat, that often in the same family one brother is a bricklayer, the second a small clerk, the third a master craftsman, while one of them has a son who, through the collective efforts of the entire family, actually attends high school. This notion of the inveterate hatred of the middle class against workers as the underlying leitmotif of fascism is of the cliched illusions of a self-styled sociology. There are many cases where the middle strata have sided politically with the workers, and many others where they have opposed them as a hostile force. But in all cases, the decisive factor has been the political situation of the moment, and certainly not the tactics of the party concerned. The general dogma clarifies absolutely nothing. In periods of deep social crisis, the middle strata will side with the workers if the party of socialism resolutely shows the road to salvation and to the construction of a new society. If, however, the socialist movement itself vacillates and lacks certainty and shrinks from the tasks of revolution and social reconstruction, it is bound to lose the support of the middle classes. In 1919, the Italian middle classes were as ready to participate in the socialist revolution as the German middle classes were after 9th of November. When, in both situations, the socialists showed themselves incapable of carrying through their tasks, the middle strata once more swung away from them. To this we should add a series of special factors. As I said earlier, in the years 1919 to 20, the socialists in Italy had won a majority in many municipalities. There they and their local supporters came to occupy the leading positions. This was perfectly correct, and the new socialists and councillors worked at least as well as the earlier bourgeois once had. However, if at a time such as this, the masses are expecting a revolution from the socialists, and this does not come, if the misery of the unemployed and the hardships of the middle class find no relief at all, and on the contrary, one sees the socialist councillors peacefully holding office in comparatively well-paid posts, then disappointment, disillusionment, and finally hatred are inevitable. These moods were of a crucial importance in Germany as well in the years leading up to the National Socialist capture of power. The socialist functionaries who sat in paid positions on the town councils and the trade unions and so on were in their overwhelming majority incorruptible types who fulfilled their duties to the working class and the public at large with a true sense of loyalty. This was so both in Italy and in Germany, but in times of crisis much more was expected from them than this routine performance of duties. The middle classes and many workers became progressively more enraged at the new socialist bureaucracy that had created comfortable positions for itself by using the class movement of the poorest groups. To all of this, we must add certain tactical mistakes that were made in the organization of strikes, especially in the sectors of vital importance to everyday life. When transport services of gas and water services shut down, this creates numerous inconveniences for the bulk of the population, including other workers in the middle class. Now, if the strikers could show people that their cause is a justified one, that they have to go on strike to defend basic living conditions for themselves and their children, then the majority of people would understand the reasons for the strike and put up with the hardships caused by it. However, in the sort of situation that Germany and Italy lived through in the years 1919 and 1920, the activity of the working class would dissolve only too easily into minor struggles over wages instead of the important political movements. The masses will support strikes as links in the chain of a major revolutionary offensive, but when the political movement is itself crumbling, isolated wage struggles are not likely to elicit much support from the public, especially when these struggles proceed from the better paid groups of workers and inflict severe hardship on the rest of the population. In 1919-20, the Italian middle classes were expecting a socialist revolution, but it never came. Consequently, the economic crisis only worsened and the mass of people sank deeper into poverty. Yet at this precise moment, the socialist leaders occupied well-paid positions and the transport workers and workers of other public services were paralyzing the life of the cities to push their wage levels higher. Excuse me. The middle class now lost the sense of feeling that it must fight side by side with the workers against the capitalists and profiteers. On the contrary, it came to see in the organized working class a self-seeking oligarchy that looked only to itself and its leadership and was bent on extorting higher and higher wages, that too at the cost of the public at large, of the taxpayers, and above all of the middle class itself. This is why the Italian intelligentsia, commercial businesses, government employees, and artisans slowly came around to believing that the socialist organizations were the real traitors to the people. That's how there emerged a general rage against the big shots, as they would come to be called in Germany, against the strike specialists. This is when the middle strata developed a positive feeling of pleasure in strike breaking and the will to wreak vengeance on the red flag. A section of the middle class joined Mussolini's stormtroopers and the rest helped the fascists by voting for them. Margherita Sarfatti writes in her malicious but psychologically interesting book on Mussolini, "Then began a strike of workers in the water supply department. The railways came to a standstill. The electricity went off. Public transport, the pride of punctual Milan, became a pure disaster, and the unplanned creation of municipalities, with the enormous number of bureaucrats they brought into being, weighed down on the taxpayers. Once dustmen started drawing ministerial salaries, the normally clean streets became perpetually dirty, and in winter one could hardly walk through them due to the snow, so that Milan started cursing. On these unswept streets, on this snow, Karl Marx was destined to die in Italy." It is far from obvious that Marx ever supported the idea of garbage piling up on the roads, and under the then socialist municipal administration, even the brain Milan street sweepers would not exactly have received ministerial salaries. But this passage does reflect in a superbly clear form the general mood of the Milanese middle class during the rise of fascism. Marxism equals strikes and filth. Fascism equals a return to order and cleanliness. Here is Sarfati's eulogy of the strikebreakers. In August, a new general strike that spread across the entire country assumed the fancy name of a legal strike. Fascism sprang on this strike and castrated it. Engineers, people from all professions, and future ministers took the place of the skilled employees on strike and brought the factories and means to transport back into motion. At that time, one saw students courageously performing factory labor for 10 to 12 hours, or running trains through rebellious parts of the city and working as conductors with unusual politeness. At the Third Congress of the Fascist Party of Italy, the leadership released the results of a survey it had conducted among some 151,000 party members regarding their particular occupation. The result is deeply significant and worth considering, even if objections are possible to some of the numbers claimed. The statistics comprised merchants, traders, and shopkeepers, 14,000, factory owners, 4,000, landowners, 18,000, students and teachers, 21,000. Members of the liberal professions, 10,000. Civil servants, 7,000. White-collar workers, 15,000. Industrial workers and sailors, 25,000. Agricultural workers, 37,000. In total, 151,000. The very large number of agricultural workers who figure in this list consist for the most part of members who had joined under compulsion in places where the fascists had destroyed the existing organizations of agricultural workers and incorporated their former membership into their own organizations. Such forced membership would also, to some extent, apply to the category of industrial workers. Moreover, the statistics make no distinction between employed and unemployed. Again, under the category merchants, traders, almost anything can pass, from large entrepreneurs down to unemployed commercial agents. Under factory owners, a certain number of independent master craftsmen are included. Surprising but thoroughly consistent with the history of fascism is the extraordinarily large number of students and intellectuals in the party. A specifically petty bourgeois tendency of fascism does not emerge from these figures. Rather, towards the close of 1921, Mussolini became the leader of a typically bourgeois party, with a particularly strong dash of intellectuals and academics and a certain following among workers. In the years from 1919 to 1922, the program of fascism underwent an extraordinarily rapid and fundamental transformation. To Mussolini, the tactics of seizing power were everything. Questions of program were, compared to this, quite secondary. In 1919, at the inception of the fascist movement, when all of Italy had moved far to the left and the capitalists were not particularly bothered about Mussolini, he had drafted a left radical program. He intended to win working class votes through a kind of nationalistic socialism. At that time, among other things, he supported a people's government based on a general and equal franchise with the right to vote for both women and men, the proclamation of a republic in Italy, the dissolution of all industrial and financial joint stock companies, the restructuring of production on corporatist lines with direct profit sharing by all the workers of the enterprise, and several other nice things. But when the big industrialists and large landowners began to put their sympathies and their bank accounts at the fascist disposal, Mussolini's program changed rapidly. In November 1921, at the above-mentioned Third Congress of his party, he assured them that while he was, of course, opposed to liberalism in the political sense, he was unconditionally in favor of economic liberalism. Quote, "If possible, I would be even inclined to hand the railways and posts and telegraph back to private enterprises in order to relieve the state of economic functions that are really quite uneconomical." End quote. In this way, fascism finally returned to an unconditional defense of private capitalism. Mussolini gave wholehearted support to the landowners of southern Italy in their struggle to forestall an agrarian revolution, yet he was never quite disposed to restoring to these semi-feudal bosses the decisive influence they had wielded in the so-called liberal period of Italian history. Fascism was and remained the party of the advanced north. Mussolini once compared his own work with that of the Turkish leader Kemal Ataturk, who, from Ankara, sought to create a new bourgeois state in opposition to the feudal Constantinople of the Sultanate. Precisely in this sense, Mussolini projected the reassuring image of himself as leader of Milan, Italy's Ankara, waging a struggle against Rome, the Italian Constantinople. Indeed, Italian fascism always fought on two fronts. This naturally does not refer to the quite fictitious two fronts of the petty bourgeoisie, which supposedly struggle simultaneously against capitalism and the proletariat. As manifold and variable as Mussolini's successive programs were, none of them show any specific interest in the petty bourgeoisie, and the fascist form of activity in Italy was quite unlike a petty bourgeois one. In 1921-22, through its daily assaults and violence, fascism defeated the organized socialist working class. Yet at the same time, it broke the dominance of the backward feudal cliques of central and southern Italy. To the landowners and the local power elites of the south, it was at the time a question of choosing the lesser evil. Not unreasonably, they perceived the agrarian revolution from the left as the greater evil, and therefore went over to fascism. But at the very same time, they were aware that with the victory of the fascists, their former dominance was doomed. Of course, they retained their landed estates and other possessions, but they could no longer hope to exert political influence with the help of the liberal politicians. Mussolini was the leader of the modern Italian North with its bourgeoisie and its intelligentsia. That is the secret of his comparatively lasting success. Mussolini has now been in power in Italy for 12 years, and for the moment, the end of fascism in Italy is not yet a real prospect. Had Mussolini really been a leader of the petty bourgeoisie, he would not have lasted even 12 months. In 1922, fascism emerged as the great united front of all the active bourgeois anti-socialist forces in the country. Behind Mussolini stood the capitalist class, the middle classes, and the intellectuals, landowners who had mixed feelings, a major part of the unemployed, who would find a source of income and something to do in the stormtroopers, and even individual groups of workers. The socialist and communist organizations were demolished completely, and the old bourgeois parties seized by a rapid process of dissolution. The state bureaucracy had got so used to seeing Mussolini as the true leader of the nation that neither the army nor the police ever seriously contemplated a struggle against the fascists. Even the King of Italy slowly came around to seeing that the liberal feudal period was over and quickly made his peace with the Duce. Under these conditions, it was a pure formality when Mussolini chased the last helpless liberal ministers from parliament and put himself in their place. In Italy, the industrial proletariat is only a minority of the population. A victory of the socialists thus depended crucially after 1919 on a democratic coalition of the workers with the peasants and the middle strata. In 1919-1920, hopeful beginnings were made in the direction of such a coalition. However, the coalition was shattered before it could be consolidated. Within the vacillating mass of the petty bourgeoisie, the fascists forcibly suppressed the rural half and won over to their side the urban half. Both these processes, the destruction of the left-wing organizations in the countryside as well as the renewed division between the urban middle class and the proletariat, were only possible due to the serious mistakes committed by the Italian socialists. Once these processes were accomplished, however, the bulk of the property class was again unified. This time under the new banner of fascism. The working class now faced a completely new situation. Prior to 1914, the modern bourgeoisie had never really exercised power in Italy. In this sense, it still had a historical task to make up for. So, the celebrated slogan about the trains now running on time has its deeper significance. Obviously, this is not to be taken in the sense of wondering whether the train services really did improve under Mussolini or really were that bad before his rise to power. The basic fact is that there was a real problem for Italy. In England, America, France, and Germany, the railway system is naturally the most modern in the world. Not today anymore. But in semi-feudal countries such as Russia and Italy, but in semi-feudal countries such as Russia and Italy were down to war, this was far from self-evident. Here the task of adapting these countries to the latest bourgeois technology still had to be accomplished. Fascism ended the exaction of tribute by the mafia and Camorra. The public funds that were formerly intercepted by the local cliques were now entirely subordinated to the interest of modern capitalism. The state capitalist concentration of the country in the so-called corporatist system facilitated the control of the country by the most efficient groups of capitalists. Heavy industry, chemicals, automobiles, aircraft, and shipping were all systematically developed. Where in all this is the petty bourgeois spirit that is supposed to form the essence of fascism? Here I am not concerned with taking up positions for or against, but with historical facts. It is a fact that the productive forces of the country were developed further by Italian fascism, at least down to the beginning of the Great World Crisis. Because of this, Mussolini gained the prestige of a successful politician, and fascism gained a mass following in the propertied strata. Mussolini himself had sufficient authority to be able to convert the stormtroopers into a sort of auxiliary police force of the newly consolidated bourgeois state once their terrorist methods became superfluous. Of course, Mussolini has not been able to solve the agrarian question in Italy. The expansion of capitalism post-1922 has in fact only increased the weight of the working class. In the next major crisis, the Italian capitalists will face renewed opposition from the mass of workers and poor peasants. At that stage, it will no longer be possible to deflect the social revolution with the notion that the task of building a fully capitalist society must first be accomplished. In the 12 years of Mussolini's regime, Italy has roughly come up to the level of the countries north of the Alps. Consequently, no special path now remains open by which it can avoid the general European forms in which the class struggle will be settled. All right, and the section on Germany begins there. About like 55% of the way. It's a good place to stop. So for those of you listening, see you next time.